Or is it? Good morning. This is a common occurrence for me. Whether it was actually unlawful for Jews to eat with Gentiles, right? That's how I remember that. In Acts chapter 10, verse 28, Peter goes to Cornelius, and one of the things that he says is that you know that it is, and there are, that's a bit of research I didn't do, but it can do it right quickly. Looking for different ways that that has been translated.
Against our laws, unlawful, forbidden.
It's only used, that expression's only used there and I think one other place in the New Testament. So there's not a lot of good spots for comparison like you would be useful. It is useful when there is a word that occurs fairly commonly to look at other places and see just how it's been used. That's what I want. King James says, and this is Peter talking to Cornelius, you know that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come to one of another nation. New King James says, you know how unlawful it is. NIV, it is against our law for a Jew to associate. Reina Valera quan abominable es para un varón judío. Anyway, so abominable in Spanish. Yeah, generally translated unlawful. Yeah, okay. Just wanted to see what other decisions people had made and how to carry that over to English. What I found looking into this, I can't find anybody, I can't find a specific Old Testament law something specifically in Scripture that would say that a Jew couldn't eat with a Gentile or go into a Gentile's house. And commentaries I looked at, I can't find anybody saying, no, here, Leviticus such and such, here's the law that Peter's referring to. The general opinion is that Peter is referring to, it's a taboo. It's a regulation of, it's a rule kept by our people that is probably viewed as practically law by the Pharisees, certainly, but there's not actually something in the Old Testament that can be pointed to. Here's kind of how they got to it. Things that you are definitely forbidden to do in interaction with Gentiles. Exodus 20, verse 3, of course, you shall have no other gods before me. You could not participate in idolatrous worship with a Gentile. Deuteronomy 7:3, they were not permitted to intermarry with Gentiles. Specifically here, having to do with the situation of the Canaanite nations that they were going to be among, that they were really not supposed to, they were not supposed to blend with that culture because it would lead them away from God. It wasn't because God thought the Jewish race was better than the Canaanite race or in some weird miscegenation fashion, but it was that God wanted his people to not intermarry with people of these other nations that worshiped other gods. There were people who came in from other nations, right? We have Ruth, a whole book of the Bible named after someone who was not a Jew, but she took on the religion of God's people. She worshiped God, and she became a proselyte, we would say. I don't know when they started using that word or what the rules were exactly for becoming that, but Ruth had become Jewish in every sense except her ethnicity or her birth. Rahab had joined with the people, and probably some others if we stopped and thought about it long enough. But they were not to get in that situation. That was the particular thing about intermarriage. And then Leviticus 11 and a lot of other places talks about unclean foods, that there were certain foods that were unclean. And how this apparently became an issue was that, and here again I'm doing my best to try to interpret. There is such an incredible body of writing that the rabbis did down through the years. There is a new website called Sefaria, Sefaria.org, which is a complete Hebrew and English parallel translation of the Talmud, which is like the big collection of the rabbis' sayings going back hundreds and hundreds of years. It's just an immense amount of stuff. So I'm afraid, any research that I try to do in that, I'm not nearly knowledgeable enough about their whole tradition of things to be sure that I'm getting the right point of view out of it. But the best that I can tell when in passages that I can find that talk about this, here's where the problem seems to have, how this thinking seemed to have evolved about eating with a Gentile or going into a Gentile's house. Number one, that Gentiles ate non-kosher foods. So if you go into a Gentile's house, if you go into someone's house back in that time, and even today, really, you offer somebody something to drink or something to eat, right? If a Gentile offered you something to eat, you couldn't be sure if it was kosher. They might have used lard from a pig in baking their bread or something. There could be something that's not kosher there, and I guess you could ask, is this kosher? Or you could ask them ahead of time, we're coming over and we can't eat certain things. So hopefully they would do that, but that'd be a socially awkward situation. So maybe it's just better to not eat with Gentiles. Or, taking it a step further, even if they prepare a kosher meal for you, they probably used those same plates to serve something non-kosher. So unless they gave the plates the proper ritual cleansing, which of course they didn't because they're Gentiles, there's probably still non-kosher cooties on the plates, so you can't eat off the plates. David?
When we sit down to a meal today, we often give thanks to God for the food that we're about to eat. Is that something that they did at the time that may have been not good for Jews to participate in?
There was a general tradition, that's the next thing actually with the Gentiles. There was a general tradition among the Gentiles, especially with wine, which was about a lot of what everybody drank in various proportions, from wine-flavored water on down to the hard stuff. There was a general trend among the Gentiles, and you see this all through, like the Iliad and the Odyssey and those old Greek stories, that they would, if they sat down to a feast, they would offer that first drink, they would offer, to our God so-and-so. And so if you went to a Greek's house, even if you didn't participate in that, if they were blessing their God with the same wine that they were serving you with, then you were kind of participating in idol worship, sort of. That even went to the extent, according to some rabbis, it was kind of weird. Some rabbis at different points in time thought, well, it's okay if a Gentile comes to your house, because then you've got control. You can be sure that all of the food is kosher. But if you, and I kid you not, I did not make this up. Like Dave Barry, I swear I am not making this up. If you got up from the table and came back, the Gentile might have taken a drink of wine from the same jug you're drinking from and blessed his idol with it in his mind, even if you didn't hear him. He might have said it, he might have worshiped his God without speaking out loud, and therefore you'd be participating in idol worship. So you better not take another drink from the same jug. But if there's another jug that's on a side table, you could drink from that one, because he probably didn't get that one. I am not making that up. So you can see how it's just a whole lot easier to say, it's just better not to eat with Gentiles. And then it goes from, well, if it's better not to eat with them, then that really means you shouldn't. And if you do, then why are you trying so hard to see how far you can go? And you get further into the guilt by association stuff. So it finally gets down to the rule of, we're just not going to have that kind of table fellowship with Gentiles. Which, yeah, there's probably a racial component to that too. There probably just is. Even though it could be, they could argue that it was in order to stay clean in a ceremonial sense. It was more about avoiding Gentile cooties. And that really seems to be, I'm glad cooties is still a relatively current term. I didn't know if people still had cooties. Okay, yeah, you have little kids, so you would know. Okay, so Peter had a problem with that, didn't he? Because that comes up in Galatians again, that Paul tells how Peter kind of had a relapse about that he was okay with the Gentile Christians until some of the Jewish Christians from Jerusalem who were less open-minded about that arrived, and then that is so classic too. That is such a classic case of the social pressure, the peer pressure of what his Jerusalem friends are going to think about him if they see him eating with the Gentiles. And, well, it was a problem, and sadly, people are not much better today. But thanks for raising that question. Hadn't never really looked at that. In Jesus going into the tax collectors, these are apparently these are all Jews, so it should have been okay, but still, that was, the Pharisees would, it'd be guilt by association. A guilt by association thing that, yeah, there's plenty more could be said about that, but we'd be running it into the ground. Something about what Jesus does here, and we didn't get time for it last time. It reminded me, Jesus going to eat with the tax collectors reminded me of a group of Christians in Abilene, I believe, maybe it was another city, who decided to go hold church services in a bar in order to reach people who would not otherwise, theoretically, would not have come to a church building. Interesting set of questions that raises. Is it wrong to hold worship services in an establishment that has been used at some point as a bar? Well, theoretically, that's just a building. In fact, the Aubrey Church of Christ is in an old bar. It's kind of funny. Where the pulpit is where the band used to be. It's kind of a funny little thing. It's a little honky-tonk, basically, that then went out of business, and then the church bought that and put pews in it. It's a different sort of, it's kind of unusual situation, but yeah, that could happen. In different times in the past, when there wasn't as much money to build church buildings, there were times when I know of congregations that met in school buildings, met in people's homes, met in all sorts of different things. Sometimes some little country communities, there would be a Church of Christ would meet at 1 hour, and the Methodists would come meet a couple hours later, and the Baptists would come in, and I guess your Seventh-day Adventists could use it the day before, right? So you'd and everybody kind of shared on the upkeep of the building. It's kind of an odd situation. So going into the bar, the question about that, anything wrong with going into a bar to try to evangelize? You're going in there, you're not drinking, you're going in there to try to talk to people. Likely to get thrown out pretty quickly, I would guess, probably, but anything wrong with going in there? Can't see that there'd be anything wrong with going for the purpose of trying to evangelize. Where does this go wrong? And the difference here that I see is, number one, there's not anything really inherently questionable about Jesus going to Matthew's house to eat dinner with this group of people. They're having a meal together. There's no indication that it's a wild, riotous party. There is something innately different about a bar, right? It's the purpose of it is a different thing. And the other side of it, and just the thing that you'd have to, and the thing I can't resolve in my mind about that idea, at least I can't resolve it in favor of what this group did, is going into a place and letting people, if people think that, okay, I can associate with these religious people and then wait around until the bar opens. And if you have set up a situation where, if you've made a situation where you're not just going to where you can reach people, but if you are making people think that it's okay for them to be where they are, that they can have Jesus without leaving their lifestyle, without leaving that lifestyle. That's another thing. That's part of probably the criticism that the Pharisees were making unjustly with Jesus. Was he approving of the ungodly lifestyle of some of these people? No. But he was associating with them in a way that didn't, there was nothing about eating dinner with them that said, I approve of your, whatever their lifestyle was, that was, caused people to refer to them as sinners. Although that's, sinners was a kind of flexible term because it depended on who was using it. If it's the Pharisees, it's anybody else. You know, it's basically everybody else but us. But presumably, and we know other times that Jesus had closer social contact with people that were definitely living sinful lives. The Samaritan woman at the well, for example. And another time when there was a woman who approached Jesus who was, well, and put it nicely, was self-employed in a bad way. That the Pharisees said if he knew what kind of woman this is, he wouldn't. Well, actually, he did know what kind of woman she was, but he saw a human being that he wanted to talk to and reach out to, but didn't approve of the lifestyle. So that's kind of the thing, I guess another thing to keep in mind here is, yeah, we want to reach out. We want to reach out, but we want to reach out in a way that we're not at the same time approving of a lifestyle that's not right. And that doesn't mean shunning people completely the way the Pharisees did, but we can go too far out the other direction, in a sense, I guess. Get to an area of judgment. Anybody have comment on that?
When you're choosing friends, it's important to choose friends that will not bring you down or compromise your situation or compromise your attitude toward
Yeah.
a simple
Yeah.
situation. And that's hard to do because sometimes there's maybe not a lot of people in a congregation. Our son and daughter-in-law are that way. There's hardly anybody up there. So
Yeah.
they choose really not to go make friends with anybody because nobody lives their life like them.
That reminds me of,
It's a really hard thing to do. But we were with some people last night at the Ranger game, and this guy was, chugging back right and left, and he said, "So your husband and you don't drink? Can you tell me why?" So that afforded us a nice opportunity to say, well, because I don't look like you can hardly even stand in that seat. But on the other hand, you do have opportunities, but
yeah.
it didn't change his life, it didn't change his, and that's the thing about going into a bar. Yeah, you can go in there and share the gospel with them, but chances are, they're interested, they're going to come to where you are, instead of the other way around. So as you said, it's not a hard line that you draw. You can't do this, you can't do that, but it's just, you have to use God's judgment when you're approaching something like that.
Yeah, and I think there's a big risk when you're walking into a bar, you are completely surrounded. Like at that point, you are one person surrounded by a whole lot of people who will disagree with you and gang up on you. Whereas, I mean, you could just as easily walk into a grocery store and find all those same people there.
Good point.
Walk into that environment where they're already intoxicated, where they're not easily going.
That's another thing. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point, and it does require wisdom. It does require applying wisdom, and it requires what's the wise thing for you to do, and what's wise, and I wouldn't recommend anybody go by themselves into a situation like that anyway. You need somebody to run call for help. David?
Another difference I see between that example and this one with Jesus is Jesus was invited by Matthew.
True.
This was a fertile ground. They were willing to hear the gospel.
These were Matthew's friends.
Mm-hmm. That's different from going to a place where, like you were saying, the people are there for a completely different reason. They're not interested in what you have to say. They were interested in what Jesus had to say. So
True.
it's a different situation.
It was a, yeah.
Why you're there to begin with.
That's a good point. This was an ideal opportunity for Jesus, now that you point that out, because these were, no doubt these were Matthew's friends. They were other tax collectors. They wanted to know probably some of them want to know what is going on. Who is this guy that came up to Matthew the other day, and Matthew's leaving his job? Matthew just quit his job. And what's this about? So there's some curiosity there, you know. What is it about this person? That's a good point.
The coworker comes up to you and says, "I've been talking to my buddy who's at the bar every night about you. He's interested in, the things that you do and believe. And he wants to meet with you, but you have to go to him because I can't get him away from the bar or whatever." That's a different situation because
That's true.
somebody's kind of opening up.
Yeah.
And,
You'd probably go. You'd want to go.
but it's different from just going in blindly because here's people that I can preach to.
Yeah. Yeah. The Rangers game is that's a great example. That's like the dinner thing. There's nothing wrong with going to a Rangers game. Nobody can, what is there to criticize about a Christian going to a Rangers game? That's a kind of a public forum where people meet on equal terms. Thank you. Those are interesting points.
That's America during the 7-inning stretch. I love Texas.
Well, new topic here. And here, kind of have to put together who all's involved, and we don't know how much time passed between these things. Matthew tells us that the disciples of John come and ask this question: why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Mark tells us that John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. People came and said, why do they do this and your disciples do not? Luke tells us, Luke puts it in the context of the Pharisees asking about this. So you have two different groups that are raising the question: the disciples of John, and this is after John had been arrested and put in prison. And then also the Pharisees were asking about the fasting because apparently Jesus' disciples didn't do that, or they didn't do it often enough that anyone noticed. Jesus' response must have raised eyebrows. Can the wedding guests mourn while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. Something made me think about some of my groomsmen the other day. Your brother was one, in fact, right? Yeah. Tom was one of the groomsmen. Was very, very graciously stepped into that very, very late, and it was very kind of him because I had, college friends that were coming to do that, and then one couldn't make it, and he stepped in as a substitute, which is awkward, but he was very gracious to do that, and I was glad he did. Thinking about the groomsmen, and, well, we had a wild time that night back in my trailer with 4 or 5 of those guys. They were playing some kind of football game on the Intellivision. Anybody remembers the Intellivision? And I went to bed. So you guys keep it down. I'm going to bed. That was how wild it was. But there were some good times, and they were all people that all guys I'd been close to, and it was nice to see them, and I appreciated so much that they were willing to come down here. Some of them were already out of school, and it wasn't very convenient for them probably, but they did it and appreciated it very much. It's a very special time, isn't it? It's a very special time. And The Jewish people, even much more so back then, and I guess the more traditional weddings today, they know how to throw a wedding, right? They know how to put on a wedding. It doesn't just last a day, it goes on and goes on and on. And even among the peasant population, this was like the one time when you were the king and queen. This was that one time in your life that it was all about you, and everybody kind of let everything stop for a minute and just had a great party. And Jesus compares his being there with them to that time, and that it just wasn't appropriate to fast, which fasting is generally associated with mourning. It's associated with mourning and with can't think of the word I want. It's a very serious, a very severe kind of thing. Then Jesus goes on to these, not quite parables. I guess it's not really a narrative, just kind of a metaphor. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. I've never done that, but I understand you put new things. I understand if you put a new shirt, if you wash a new shirt and then you put it in the dryer and you turn on high heat, depending on what it's made out of, bad things may happen to it. That's why I taught William the rule about women's clothes in the laundry. Everything gets hung, everything is line dry. Just line dry everything. Or don't wash it. Just only wash your own stuff. Is that how that works? Okay, my own stuff, I'll wash it whatever way I want. If it shrinks, if it wears out, if it turns weird colors, that's whatever. I'll still wear it. But women wear clothes made out of weird stuff that's not a practical material, that it can't. I'm sorry, but why do you want stuff that you can't throw in the dryer? Anyway, I know stuff shrink. What's that? What'd you say? I'm sorry.
I said because it's pretty.
Because it's pretty. Well, and it is. So I guess that's a good reason. And I wouldn't want to be any different. But I understand that things shrink. And if you had something that was already shrunk and then you patched a piece of material into it and then washed it like that, well, of course, that's going to shrink up and it's going to tear it up even worse than it was. A bad repair on something can make it a lot worse than it was in the first place. That's what I found out trying to work on plumbing. You're better off to leave it alone. And the next of these, you don't put new wine into old wineskins. And that's kind of a different, I don't have any experience of that kind of thing, but you know that this is something that ferments. Like if you open up a bottle of grape juice, been in the back of the fridge, and it kind of goes when you take the lid off. You've experienced this, and you think that's probably gone a little off. The fermentation process causes it to expand. What they do, of course, is put this into a new wineskin. So you have the new wine into a new wineskin. That skin, being leather, has a certain amount of stretch to it. I know that from having a pair of leather shoes, actual leather shoes once, that they stretch. It's nice. They kind of stretch out and fit your feet. So the new leather has some stretch to it. But you know what happens with old leather stuff? It kind of gets stretched about as far as it's going to go, and then it'll start to crack if it gets too much pressure on it. If you put the new wine in the old leather skin, the old leather container, and this was kind of just a big bag sort of thing. You really don't want to know how they made that. It's like made out of a goat, and then you're drinking out of it. Anyway, if you put new wine into it, the pressure build up, there's no elasticity in the leather, there's no elasticity left, and it'll burst. Luke adds, and Luke is the only one that repeats this part, Luke adds this little bit in verses 38, 39, verse 39, and no one after drinking the old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. It's a cryptic statement. Well, to start with, the whole thing is about fasting, and here again, what the law actually required. The law required for you to fast on the Day of Atonement. That's all. Pharisees had the custom, and we find from Luke 18:12, Pharisees had the custom of fasting twice a week. I think it was Tuesday and Thursday. And that just seemed like a good number to them, and that's what they did. And that's fine, right? It's fine for them to do that. Then they start holding it over everybody else that, well, we fast twice a week. How many times do you fast? It's like it's a competition. And for our purposes about fasting today, all that Jesus ever says really about fasting is how to do it and not really anything about when. Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, this is about all he says about fasting, is when you fast, don't go around looking like you're fasting. Don't make yourself look as pitiful as you can so that everybody will say, oh, are you okay? No, I'm just fasting. It's okay. You know, you don't want to make a show of it. What's the point? You know, your fasting is done between yourself and God, is Jesus' point about that. So don't do it just to make other people notice how spiritual you are. And then in this passage, of course, Jesus points out that there's a time to fast and there's a time not to. And that's all he says about it. Now, we know that people fasted. In the book of Acts, there were Christians fasting when they sent Paul and Barnabas out from Antioch. The church at Antioch had a period of fasting as they were deciding what to do there and as they were preparing to send them out on their missionary trip. So sure, fasting is a fine thing for a Christian person to do, but it's your business. We're just kind of left without much, without much more than that. The questioners here are the disciples of John. Now, you can understand if they're following John the Baptist, they're probably living a pretty severe lifestyle. John is a man who, you could almost call that a perpetual, it would be, if it were me, it would be a perpetual fasting. If all I had was locust and honey, I'd eat the honey and leave out the locust. But John lived a very limited ascetic lifestyle. And so you can imagine the disciples of John probably were a lot like him. You know, they just lived in a very simple fashion and probably used to that idea of fasting. And John's in prison. They can't necessarily get in to ask him about this, but they know that John pointed towards Jesus. They still haven't made the jump over to following Jesus, but they come to him as someone that John approved of. And they want to know, so, they're trying to figure out maybe so you're really different from John, right? He was. And the Pharisees, they saw this as a weapon, right? They're looking for something to accuse him with. Always going to be some really good productive debate when one side is looking for something to get the other person with rather than asking because they want to know something. And from the way Mark says this, you jump back up there and look at that again. Yep. There. From the way Mark introduces this, right after talking about the feast with Matthew, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Almost makes it sound like it's the same time, which that would be even more interesting, right? If Jesus is at a big meal at Matthew's house on one of the days that the Pharisees and the disciples of John were fasting, not only do you all not fast, you're having a feast on this day. So what's the reason for that? And Jesus points out that fasting is for a purpose. That fasting is appropriate to a purpose, to a certain time. He talks about the bridegroom and his groomsmen. That was a festive time. The disciples were like his groomsmen. And while they were together, it wasn't appropriate for them to be fasting and mourning. They were still together. In fact, if you were fasting during somebody's wedding feast, that's kind of, don't do that. You know, you don't do that. Yeah, and you'd think if you wear black to a wedding, people think you're trying to say something. You know, if you showed up fasting at a wedding feast and they ate, boy, they just put it all out there. If you showed up fasting at a wedding feast and you wouldn't eat, you're kind of showing disregard. The kingdom is a time for joy. The gospel is good news. And so this wasn't a time to fast. This was a time to celebrate what Jesus came for. John 10, verse 10, Jesus said, I came to give life that you could have life and have it more abundantly. That's an important point. I mean, there are things about the Christian life that it looks like, yeah, you give up a lot of things. But really, you're getting more lasting things. It's at least leading towards a better, bigger life. And a really ironic part of this, too, is saying there'd be a time for fasting. 40 days and 40 nights wasn't enough, huh? You know, he could have said that to them, I guess. I fasted 40 days and 40 nights out in the wilderness. Now you expect me to do it again? But then he also refers to when the bridegroom is taken away. When's that? When he's crucified. So, yeah, you know, let them have this time. Let them have this time. There's plenty of time to fast later. And of course, there would be fasting later on in the Christian era, just not in the regulated sort of way. Well, thank you for being here. We'll get finished up on that next week, I guess, Lord willing.